Hello, and welcome back to another episode of International Immersion, a podcast that seeks to capture the combined experiences of people, culture, places, traveling, current events, living abroad, and everything that comes along with them. For tonight's episode, we want to go into a more deeper context and topic, and that is to kind of begin a bit of a number of episodes on nationalism and populism and other ideologies and methodologies that we are seeing more and more in this day and age. So for this episode, I have my father back on, who I would say has a quite in-depth experience with studying this and also keeping track of politics, news, and other things from both a current and historical background, along with myself. So Dad, it's great to have you on again tonight.
Great, Sean. Yeah, glad to be back. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so for this episode, I thought it'd be good to kind of really delve deeper into these topics because as we both know, we tend to focus on these aspects. We want to learn about them, delve more deeply into the factors that influence them, how they rise and fall, historical tendencies that are repeated again and again, and also maybe to explain to people, in at least from our viewpoints and from what we observe, what's going on in this day and age.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a process, right?
Very much so. So to begin with, I think the biggest question we need to answer is for everyone would be what is nationalism and populism to begin with? A lot of people may know this, but, just to kind of be very blunt, the definition of nationalism is basically the identification of one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations and its people. So in a sense, nationalism is basically putting your country first, which in many ways everyone should because that's where they live. But at the same time, there are both, I would say, acceptable and extreme versions of this.
Yeah, that's a good place to start with that.
Exactly. And on the other coin, populism, which I would say is something we've seen more and more recently with politics in the U.S., but also politics globally, highlighted specifically, I'd say the U.S., Europe, and other countries. But, the basic definition of populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to the ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups, or basically kind of the masses versus the elites, which has been a common trend throughout history, but it's something that is continuing and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
So
and we can explore contrasts of those as well. Perhaps some historical context and things in this first episode and kind of let it evolve from there.
Exactly. So to begin with, I think we can focus a little bit on nationalism because nationalism is nothing new and it's something that consistently rears its head again and again. And in many cases, it's been responsible for a large number of conflicts in both recent and, more and further back in history. But, so I think in many ways, nationalism has been a great tool for the state or for organizations, in the past to bring people together for a common cause. Because as they say, nothing unites people like an external threat or opponent.
Yeah, whether internal to that country itself or something from abroad. Yes.
Yeah. And I think, and a lot of times it can be a foreign entity or it can be a perceived foreign entity within a country's own borders, which I think today in the U.S., you're seeing both of those things in a number of ways.
Yeah. I think that from a nationalism perspective, we have to keep in mind, that some of the things we're talking about on this particular podcast are going to be controversial because nationalism can be applied definition or in practice, depending upon the intent of those that are using that tool for whatever reason.
Exactly. And that's a very important, thing we want to, disclose to our audience is that we're just talking about this based on our own experiences, what we've studied, what we see, and a number of other factors, but we're not trying to target one group or, do anything specific. We're just trying to bring these concepts into greater into a more perceivable light and kind of delve into them and to discuss them and explain more and more, just to give people more of a, grounding on these topics, I would think. And I think that would be a good way to describe it.
Yeah, no, I think that's appropriate. And I think that, full disclosure on my part, I would classify myself generally, as a more liberal-minded, progressive-minded person, an individual, primarily because I pride myself on my ability to think critically, have an open mind, etc. And I personally would contend that attitude towards nationalism or populism in general is the way in which to understand it and to have its use be applicable in a way that will have more positive outcomes necessarily than some of the other examples that may exist out there.
No, very, very well said. And I would say, for disclosure as well, I would say I definitely tend to lead more moderate on many things, but there are a number of issues or a wide range of issues that I can go more liberal or conservative. But generally, I would say I'm a little more liberal overall, but my personal thoughts and beliefs do kind of trend in both directions depending on what subject and what matter at hand there is, which I think many people do, but I think it's important. You cannot be all one or the other. You have to have, kind of a equal ground on some things, because extremism on either end, the right or the left, is never healthy, as we've clearly conceived now and have seen throughout history.
Yeah. So when you think about nationalism in that example, I think that's very well spoken, because by having, obviously intent is going to create the outcome of what you're using nationalism or populism for. So having more of an independent perspective, if you want to use independent in a political sense, that lends itself for an ability to be able to slide in either direction towards your own personal intent or the group that you're with, towards whatever outcomes or change, or progressive attitudes and mentalities that you would want to be able to create that change around.
No, very well said. And I think you bring up a larger point here, is that no one ideology or methodology is inherently bad. It's all about how it's used and applied. Nationalism by itself can be a great tool for bringing people together for the common good and to improve the situation of a country, a state, or an entity, whatever it is. But at the same time, if it's used incorrectly, it can cause tremendous amounts of damage and human loss, destruction, and I would say economic and basically overall negative results.
Yes, and that can happen whether you would consider yourself, in quotes, be left or right. So it's not that I or we, are labeling one particular political movement, or cultural movement to fall into those categories. We're just saying that in order to be able to leverage nationalism and populism to their best effect, their most progressive effect, is from that more independent type of open-minded attitude, which brings people together, as you said, and that's very well put. It's very powerful, nationalism being a very powerful tool in that respect, but not necessarily at the expense of the body politic, or the state as a whole, which there's a lot of connections and controversy in the United States and in Europe and other places in the modern era that are being affected by the more extreme elements that, in my perception, don't allow for a greater inclusion or tolerance from a more populist perspective.
Exactly. And I think and that's another interesting thing, is that you're seeing more and more of these two ideologies, it being interchangeable and interconnected, even though they're not specifically tied to each other. You're seeing more and more of it, because I think in the situation in the United States now and in the relative recent, period of time, you're seeing, definitely a nationalist sentiment in some ways, but you're also seeing this populist sentiment because of a large amount of the population's discontent with the status quo, with the economic system, Wall Street, politics, political deadlock, and all these other things. So, and going back, you can kind of see how these things manifest off and on throughout history based on different, I would say, situations and periods of time where lends to the, proliferation of either idea, either together or separately.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I think that if we hearken back historically to ancient Rome and ancient Greece as an example, Greece in particular, from a political perspective, one of the things that I observe in the United States as an example, and I'm sure it's probably a factor outside the United States, is this idea, this Greek, I'm not sure what the original Greek word was, but the English word is the dialectic, bringing together opposite perspectives, either from the nationalistic point of view or a more populist perspective, bringing them together so that their intent and their ultimate outcomes can be more of a blending, a more of a kaleidoscope of both sides of the fence and the outcomes that they want for that. I think that when you look at certain nationalistic movements within the United States today in the modern era, they seem to be fueled, in my opinion, by a certain lack of education. Secular education is one example. Cultural understanding, like that the United States was and became what it is today because of immigration, as one specific example. And as a result, then you end up with a situation where propaganda creeps into it, or those motivators that have the intent that they want to create division as opposed to inclusion within their different intentions. And what happens is you end up having, that part of nationalism, which ends up attempting to denigrate, or eliminate a particular part of society that really could help to further those ends as a result. And they end up losing out on a certain section, of the population from that populist perspective, that could actually dialectically make the overall situation better for everyone.
Now, you bring up some very good points there. You're kind of breaking those down piece by piece, and that, I think education, first and foremost, I think is the most important thing any citizen of a country can have. They need to be able to have the cognizant ability to think for themselves in terms of dissecting each methodology, political ideology, economic, thought theory, whatever, and not just these, but many, many other things. They need to have the ability to go through that and do that. And while many people do, I've observed, and I know from a lot of factors and just watching news and traveling, you definitely meet people who cannot. And that is very unfortunate in my mind, because in many cases, those types of people are the ones that become victims of either of these, ideologies used in the wrong way. And I think what's happening now is that a lot of people, when you join a movement, it's exciting, it's interesting, you're among like-minded people, but I think in many cases that can blind you and you stop actively thinking about what you're doing. And that's where things can happen, like the riot in the Capitol back on January 6th, correctly. That, I think that's an example of that, to an extent, gone too far. Not to bring politics specifically into the situation or discussion, but that is an example, I think, of what blind nationalism or blind populism, in terms of what happened in Argentina with Juan Perón and that regime in the 50s, that those are examples of how things can kind of go downhill rather quickly.
Yes, and it borderlines on the controversial subject, of a cultish mentality. So I think on both sides of that nationalistic and populist type of perspective, the cultish mentality can creep into that, where even regardless of your level of education and regardless of a belief system, if you want to bring religion or philosophy into it, these folks end up becoming so blinded, to use your words, of what it is they're trying to accomplish, that they don't see the other avenues or the quote wormholes or the quickening surrounding how inclusion would actually create potentially a better and more integrated society for all aspects of a nation, because we know that nations aren't just made up of particular political, cultural, economic movements. They're multi-tiered, multi-leveled, and all those, tiers and levels interact with each other. So one of, from a governmental perspective, one of the great challenges of a democracy, is inclusion, not necessarily the segregation of things. And we've seen with a lot of recent examples in the U.S., there's probably too many to name, that a lot of the things that maybe have not progressed towards inclusion to the point that they would need to create more of an equilibrium have been exposed, whether you want to take it into the racial realm, or extreme political ideologies, etc. Those things have kind of come out, which is one of the benefits of the extreme pendulum swinging to the point where it is so in the media. However, the media plays that role on either side of the fence. It's so much in the forefront of people's consciousness that it actually gives an opportunity for people to question their own implicit bias, their own cognitive dissonance, so to speak. But if you're too entrenched in either part of that process, as you say, you will be blinded to a greater possibility of inclusion, which any nation, it behooves them to always create inspection and reminder points. Are we including as much of the population from a populist standpoint that we can for the betterment of all layers of our economy, our political system, governmental system, cultural interconnectedness? Are we doing that? Becomes the question. And sometimes that question is a hard question. Sometimes it can't be completely resolved, maybe only partially. But the direction has to be towards that inclusion in order for a nation, to really benefit from every quality that its individual citizens have, their individual temperaments, talents, and convictions being leveraged, towards the greater body politic or the state.
No, I think you bring up a great point again, in that the fact that, a state, a nation, a political entity, it's always going to be strongest when all levels are synchronized to their maximum potential, both politically, socially, culturally, economically. But when like you're saying, when you create these divides or you have this turmoil, that's going to erode the sustainability and functionality of the state and society and the society and various cultures that make up that society based on the type of people that are there. And granted, and I think the one key factor that drives a lot of the elements in both of these ideologies is fear, and more specifically, fear of the unknown. Because fear of the unknown, I'd say, has probably been one of the biggest factors in wars, conflicts, misunderstandings, because people simply do not know the other, or this other idea, this other theory, whatever you want to say it. And that by itself can make people do some very, I would say, what's a good word? Crazy things. Potentially.
Yeah, I think that if I can quote Voltaire correctly here, I think he said, if you can convince people of absurdities, you can also convince them to do horrible atrocities. And that's paraphrased, but I think that was essentially what Voltaire's meaning was there in that kind of paraphrased quote. So I think that the inherent danger that we all have to question ourselves about, because it's also about vulnerability and self-honesty to yourself and vulnerability to the plight or ideas and ideologies of folks or groups that you would perceive as being different. I guess that's where tolerance plays a key role in inclusion. Just because you look different or you think different or you believe something different doesn't mean there's not value to the greater society in its social contract. from both sides of the fence. I think when people get entrenched, as you were alluding to, into one part of that, nationalism becomes more of a blight, than something that people can rally around. And from a populist standpoint, you have more of the political ideologies that developed and were corrupted, in my opinion, in things like Marxism or Leninism, or things that happened, in history regarding, quote, communism in general. So I think that we always have to remind ourselves, that am I going down that path? Am I taking an extreme view that removes inclusion or understanding, or specific to my example about dialectic conversations and dialogues from the average person on the street all the way up to the halls of government?
Very well said. And I would definitely agree with you on most of your points there. And I think the main issue is that a lot of people are simply not exposed to anything
education.
That they don't already know, or what they've been brought up to accept or deem appropriate based on family, community, and their local beliefs, customs, traditions, so on and so forth. And I think this is where, like you said, education is a big factor. Traveling, friendships, delving deeper into different, philosophical ideas in the realms of politics, stoicism, so many other things. I would say, just to try to have a sense of yourself and not just be part of whatever where you are, what you believe, and all those factors in themselves. I'm not saying that anyone's not good or bad. That's irrelevant. But the point is, I think people need to identify who they are as a person, and that really will help them kind of think more in-depthly and more critically, because a lot of people, they don't really have a sense of themselves, and that is an issue. And this is getting more into, I think, more societal and more of a personal discussion.
Psychological part of it, yeah.
But it definitely is an influencing factor. But I think at the end of the day, education is first and foremost the most important. And granted, like you said, bias. Everyone's going to have implicit bias or natural biases for a wide range of reasons. That's not a problem. But I think it's very important that you understand what your biases are. And that may not be easy, but I think it's very important.
Yeah, and that's where cognitive dissonance comes into play. Now, education can be prevalent. I guess the insidious part of any side of the coin, left or right, to use those general examples, can be insidious. You can be well educated, but have a particular agenda that you actually don't care. Not you, but any one individual does not care about inclusion. And that's a conscious decision towards a particular end.
Exactly, because people who have reached a certain level of education, they may realize, hey, I can benefit from this. I can make money from this. I can increase my own power, prestige, whatever from this. And that has been repeated throughout human history since its recorded inception.
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. If you look at it from a populist standpoint, you've got the masses rising up against the elites, as in the definition that you started this podcast with. So there very well could be, and there's historical examples of folks in the elitist branch who made conscious decisions that I'm going to use the population as a whole to better particular ends, whether exclusively selfish, and I use that in the small self, more of a, I guess what you would call malignant narcissism as one example, and then vice versa from the standpoint of, the masses rising up and basically wiping out, the elites, because they have not included the success that they have created, maybe from a capitalistic perspective, economic perspective, and just said, well, it's just better to wipe the slate clean.
No, good point. And that definitely says a lot right there. And it has a lot of insinuations. And I think going further with, I think a lot of the populist sentiment you're seeing in the US, I would say, just as an example, I think a one factor of many, which can be discussed in greater depth, but I think one key factor that I think has caused a lot of disenfranchisement, dissatisfaction, others, I would say, is the erosion of the middle class in the last few decades. Because when people have a good standard of living, are comfortable, they're not going to be as questioning or as, I would say, outspoken, because their quality of life is good. They're reaping the benefits of the system, society, economic, initiatives, etc. But when people start to suffer and they start to lose out, and they can see others that's going to breed resentment, and that feeds into a populist movement. And I think that's what you've seen.
Or nationalistic.
Exactly, either one. And I think that's what you're seeing in many cases, like with President Trump's campaign. There was definitely a strong populist and nationalistic elements.
There were both. Yes, that's a good call out.
But at the same time, I think just not, that's just one example, but I think there's a deeper sense here. And also, I think that kind of goes in with just our previous discussion about the multiculturalism in the U.S. and different ethnicities in the United States, which are benefiting, which are not. Those are all factors that can feed into this. In many cases, I think a lot of this is very much economic based, even though it's not necessarily but it's a huge triggering factor.
Yes, I think that there's two aspects in there that we can talk about. There are others, but there's two. One of them is what you've mentioned, which is economic. The other is more political. And I don't think you can disconnect politics from a lot of the stuff that's happening today.
Oh, no, because that's how so many of these ideas, thoughts are being channeled, is through political discussion, political leaders, etc.
Yeah, the opportunity, of economics and how that's either, progressively put into place to benefit a variety of different socio or economical strata within the United States or any country, is an important part of what fuels that. On the political scale, it's those making a conscious decision to forward a political ideological agenda as opposed to the quote greater good, however groups or individuals would define it. So as soon as you kind of cross over that political line of I'm going to cover myself because I think it's in the best interest of my political ideology, there on the other side of that, something has to be sacrificed, because that individual politician or group of politicians, is making a conscious choice to forward an agenda that's not necessarily inclusive to the entire nation. And on the other side of that, you have, folks who dilute it to the point where the greater good becomes almost unattainable because it is not prioritized in a way that creates that inclusion, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Hence, that's the roots of many cases of radicalism, both in the individual and within a group or political body. And that's demonstrated by both, extremes. Any political party has its moderate to extreme elements, and those are always, in a way, fighting with each other for which spectrum of the spectrum is going to take precedence or take charge.
Exactly. So leadership, when you think about leadership, either from a populist or nationalistic perspective, true leaders are the ones that are always looking for ways to include those other portions of the process, so the strata of the process. Leaders that are more demagogic, or propagandic because of the choices that they've made in terms of that agenda, are the ones that usually bring societies down. And there is just tons of historical examples, things we could go into that would be an entirely different podcast to this one. But I think in general, that's where the psychology of the individual, self-honesty, vulnerability, being and educating yourself. If you can't necessarily fall into a particular educational system, it's like Isaac Asimov said, always be in a situation where you can self-educate, even if you are already out of an educational system, if that makes sense.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's a very important thing about life in this current age is you never stop learning. You're always going to be learning. And you as an individual should take a strong emphasis on educating yourself. Just because you've done your, primary, elementary, secondary, higher education does not mean, like you said, you're going, that you're not going to fall prey to these types of ideologies or, part of them or whatever. But in a greater sense of the individual, it's to your benefit to continuously improve and learn about new things. It doesn't matter really what, but as long as you're continuing to learn and educate yourself about new and interesting things that can benefit you, those around you, and society, or everything to a greater extent, the more educated people you have who can, manage money better, who can, take care of a house better, who can, use more efficient, energy sources, things like that. All these different things can improve society as a whole. But I think a lot of people that I've seen, heard of, etc., a lot of people don't do that. They finish something and they kind of sulk away. Not disrespect anyone. It's just, I think a lot of people, it's like they kind of cap themselves to an extent at times in terms of learning and expanding themselves.
Right. Now, what we've just said being said, I think one of the pitfalls to education or self-education is that you can go down a road of insulation. You're just learning more and more and more about what you want to learn of, which supports perhaps a cognitive dissonance process.
That's very true.
Not looking outside of an inclusive perspective. That's where the dialectic, most people don't even know what that is. If you ask the average person on the street, they're probably going to not know what dialectics is. But it's important because it is a system and a methodology to get to a middle ground. And within a social contract, democratic society like we have in the US as an example, that's critical, especially at the governmental level, because otherwise you see the gridlock that we've seen over the past 10, 20 years, however, you want to define that at any one point.
At minimum, you can say the last several administrations.
You could say that, yes.
And I think that's a great point you bring up. And a good example would be like, there's so many people that they only watch Fox News, or they only watch CNN, or they only watch MSNBC, so on and so forth. I understand that, you have a chosen media source, but the problem is if you only rely on one media source, that definitely can have implicit bias and definitely has a good amount of political spin and is pushing the audience to believe certain things or certain ways about something, that's going to, I would say, disconnect you from the mainstream. And I think a very important thing that you need to do is you need to increase the number of media sources you expose yourself to, because that's going to give you different, I think a very important term here, points of view on the same story. Because at the end of the day, if you're educated, you know how to dissect information and generate a conclusion in your mind. Don't give me the political spin. Don't give me commentation on whatever. I just want the facts. I want the information so I can make my own decision. But a lot of the news sources out there today, they don't necessarily do that. They're trying to push a specific agenda or perspective on something. So,
well, that's where critical thinking.
Exactly.
Again, education is one thing, but being educated on how to critically think, how to compare and contrast, and to overcome those implicit bias. It kind of boils down between the concept of believing in something or belief and wonder. If you have enough wonder about the differences around you, your belief doesn't have to be sacrificed in terms of getting to know, understand, be inclusive and tolerant of different ideologies, different perspectives, different cultural norms. That, I think, ties into some of the things we've talked about on other podcasts, which is if more of a particular population had the opportunity to immerse themselves in a different culture or a different system of a social contract from a different country perspective, I think we'd see potentially, there's other factors that support or don't support that, you would see a much more broader or larger view that the general individual would have to kind of the world society, so to speak.
Oh, exactly. Hence the purpose of this podcast. What's the second word? Immersion. The more people immerse themselves in different things, the more it's going to at least give them the potential to be more open-minded. Because a lot of times people are like scared of the unknown. They actually go and do something. Oh, wow, I can do it. Just like, the idea of confidence. A lot of times people are scared to do something or exercise, whatever. But once they realize they can do it, they realize, wow, I should never have been scared of this in the first place. But that's a big problem, is some people will never actually take that step to do it. And granted, there are a lot of factors, that, because if you want to travel and this stuff, you need money, you need time and other things. But in more of a conceptual perspective, they don't mentally take that leap or try.
And from a larger macroscopic perspective, a lot of nations don't necessarily focus on that type of experience for their citizens. I know that
very much so. Yeah, very, very, very much so.
Well, that's why you see in a lot of collegiate here in the United States and other types of international programs where they send students to different countries. That type of perspective, I think, is underutilized. As long as the core principles, of wonder versus belief exclusively, fuel the reasons for doing them, the intention of sending students. And it's probably why, at the university level, those that take that to heart are going to have a larger view of the world. They're going to be in a potential position to bridge those cultural, economic, or political, gaps, thresholds.
Exactly. And I think because of that, that's why we've made so many improvements on the global scale, because of globalization, regardless of your perspective on it, and because of interconnection. That has certainly helped, especially with the technological advancement of social media and communication. That has really helped. But at the same time, those factors alone do not guarantee this is going to continue.
Social media is a great example of that, because social media, as well-intentioned as it probably was, generally speaking, has also caused its own insulary pockets, that propagate a lot of the concepts that we're talking about, either populist or nationalist in perspective, or a conglomeration thereof. As you said, birds of a feather will flock together, but it's also important to notice and to be interactive with other groups of birds, to use that example, or you will not see beyond the bubble of what that represents. And the difference will become a threat and not something to be learned from.
Oh, very well said. And like you said, many people, they are in a bubble or have put themselves either intentionally or unintentionally in a bubble. And that right there is, is very unfortunate. But what can you do in many cases,
Well, it's interesting, because I think at the heart of a lot of nationalistic perspectives, maybe more so than populist, that's something that I have to kind of look into a little bit more. But I think from the nationalistic side, the kind of primal reaction that seems to flow through a lot of nationalistic movements all over the world is this idea of tribalism. And it's something that we can potentially get into in another,
discussion.
Yeah, another part of this series. But tribalism is the kind of a primal base where nationalism, people will revert to. It's like, back in the days of the clans, in Scandinavia, or
Scotland,
or the Mongols, or whatever particular group you want to assign that to, was, we are the tribe, we are the chosen one, and these other folks that are different from us, they need to bend to our will, without necessarily taking into consideration that other tribe has a depth of richness in culture, economics, whatever it may be, that actually, if it was more of an inclusion, would provide for something completely new and different, to come into being, that particular tribe could end up evolving further in concert with those other tribes that were different as a result.
Oh, that's been very vividly displayed throughout history. Going back to history again, which we do a lot, but it's just so relevant. And that is another element that comes out of that is ethnocentrism. The idea that your own culture, values, practices, beliefs, etc., are superior, because, like you said, each tribe or each group, they identify for a number of range of factors. They all look the same. They all have the same religion. They all have the same culture, whatever it may be. But because of that, that can also breed like a sense of superiority, as you kind of hinted there as well. And you've seen this, played out many, many times. And just look at the argument for conflicts or conquests that have been made by leaders or groups. And what do they use to justify that? Oh, they're different from us. Oh, they don't believe the same thing we do. They practice certain things that we don't like, so on and so forth. All those are factors that play into that. And yeah, it kind of boils down to, how people identify, why they identify the way they do, what elements make up their identity, and then what is the school of thought in that society or community or whatever about the outside. Now, I think there definitely are exceptions to that rule. And I would say one example would be the Romans. Now, granted, they did a lot of bad things, so on, blah, blah, blah. But the reason why the Romans were so successful is because they were inclusive. They didn't care where they got ideas from. If they were effective, they utilized them. So, and I think
what is that? Pragmatism? Is that pragmatism?
Yeah, pragmatism. Also, they were an inclusive culture or an inclusive society in a way. Not everything, but at least in terms of many ideas and practices. And I think in a way, the U.S. is like that in its core or its core idea. We bring people in. If you want to come be part of the United States and contribute, that's all that really matters. But I think at the same time, a lot of the elements within both nationalism and populism can definitely push that to the side or try to erode that.
Yeah, the fear of difference. It also speaks psychologically to the individual in that group's sense of identity.
Very true.
It's almost many times observable by myself and the groups, my spheres of influence, and those I see that are different to that. There is a fear. There is a genuine concern that you will lose that identity as a result of that inclusive process. But every time, personally speaking, spheres of influence, that gap has been bridged, there's always a greater sense of the diversity simply within my own life, as one example, or the lives that I've seen other people go through that too. So the examples, at least observable and experiential from my standpoint, is you don't lose your identity. You engender a greater sense of identity within yourself because of that inclusiveness, of that dialectic attempt to understand.
No, I think that's very important. And I think, like we hinted at earlier, is that, we all have an identity that's, a construct of what we're surrounded with, how we're brought up, et cetera. But also, everyone has to create a sense of their own identity, and how those two interact can vary. But also, then how does that interact with, identities further afoot? And
and it circles back to the point that you made earlier, which is that a lot of folks don't really have an understanding of their own self-identity, so they take on the identity of a group, whether nationalistic or populistic, because they don't really have a connection to what it is that they feel that they are, or maybe even close to understanding what their nature as an individual is. And that's kind of a source of even another segment in this process, which is the psychological determination of one's own self-identity. Most of us, myself included, when it comes to certain things, are more parroting, a collective consciousness, or from a Carl Jungian perspective, a collective unconsciousness, that doesn't really have a sense of itself. So it attaches itself to something else so that it can feel that it does.
Oh, very, very true. Very true. And there's been so much research, both psychological, social, and other schools of thought that have been done on this. And I think that it's something that just defines us as humans.
Very much human nature. Yes,
humans. We're social creatures. We identify by a wide range of factors, and that can both influence a wide range of behaviors that are prosecuted in the world today. But I think, and kind of to wrap it up, I think it all goes back to the sense of yourself, education, critical thinking. And I think critical thinking is so undervalued in the fact that it's not it's not the question everything or think everything's wrong. It's just you should question something if you don't understand it, And if it makes sense, okay, fine, I'll do it. But if it doesn't make sense, and it's like, why am I doing this? Then why would I do that?
Critical thinking is an attempt to understand based on the largest variety of factors. You're balancing these together to create, a sense of understanding coupled with self-knowledge. So if you don't understand something, you have much more of a propensity to fear it. Exactly.
And if you take a step back and just think to yourself, okay, why is this different? Why do I fear it? And simply look into it, that may solve the problem right then and there. But a lot of people don't do that for a whole host of reasons.
It's terrifying sometimes, because if you don't have any level of coalesced self-identity, then that can be absolutely terrifying. It's much easier not to think for yourself in those situations or those examples.
You just said it right there. A lot of people don't want to put the time and effort into it, which is understandable. Whatever you find.
No, I get it. I totally get it. I mean, it's not my worldview, but I also appreciate that it is terrifying, and certain aspects of it, even with the way I see my worldview, are still terrifying. And they probably always will be, because they speak to the idea, maybe the inconclusive aspect of human nature and psychology, which of course is potentially a whole nother podcast. But we're touching on, somewhat generalities and how, these various factors are creating movements, within modern society.
Exactly. And I think, we can definitely discuss more of what we think or hypothesize what may happen in the coming, years and decades based on the situation now, and kind of where the trends have been moving based on what's happened in the past. But like I mentioned, that can be a whole discussion in of itself for another time.
Mm-hmm.
But Dad, I really appreciate kind of breaking down a little bit of a background on both these concepts and kind of explaining a myriad of factors that influence them and define them based on people, events, history, and other factors. But I think this has been a great start to this series, and I just wanted to appreciate the time and the contemplation we've had this evening about these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for our audience, you've got a father and son and father. So this is just for our audience's benefit. This is something that, I have really connected to with you, and then you've connected, with me. And it represents a deepening of our own relationship, however similar or different we might be as individuals. So I guess from a father, son to father perspective, I really appreciate the opportunity to engage it with you in this way.
Well, yeah, and I think you definitely have some good points there, and also you're having two different generational perspectives on this.
Yep.
Plus, you're having two peoples who have different life experiences, but also similar life experiences, and we can discuss this to an extent where we can kind of bridge different things, highlight different aspects and elements that are going on, but come at them from two similar but yet different approaches at the end of the day, since we're two different people.
Yep, that's an awesome call out to end the podcast.
Exactly. Well, it's been a pleasure, Dad, and like we said, we'll be continuing with this series and delving deeper into both of these topics. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode. Feel free to let us know if you have thoughts, questions, or comments. Feel free to email us at internationalimmersionpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll gladly get back to you. We hope that the situation with COVID-19 will continue to improve so we can get back out and travel the world and continue to learn and explore and, further develop our sense of ourselves and what this world has to offer. So this has been another episode of International Immersion, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you all, and take care and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.